Welcome back. Our last segment was a discussion of the life of Ibn Sina. Now we'll conclude our discussion of Ibn Sina by examining his works on philosophy, and we'll return to the most influential Islamic peripatetic philosopher on the West, Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes in Latin. Ibn Sina wrote about 220 books, a colossal output, including a defense of Sufism. Turning to his philosophical works, Ibn Sina represents a synthesis of the several centuries that came before him, at the same time opening doors to everything that came after him. There's no Islamic thinker later on, even those opposed to him, who is not influenced by Ibn Sina. Now, the philosophical works can be divided into two types: peripatetic, which are his most famous works, and then his works related to his Oriental philosophy, a cluster of works that deal with a more mystical philosophy mentioned in our readings. The most important peripatetic work is the Kitab al-Shifa, the largest philosophical encyclopedia ever written by one man in the history of the world. This work is in a sense the Summa of Masha'i philosophy. Besides this, Ibn Sina wrote books which deal with a more esoteric philosophy concerning the visionary aspect of reality, that is, the cosmic and metacosmic reality seen in a visionary manner, and therefore translated aptly by Henri Corbin as the visionary recitals. Now, what does Ibn Sina say? It's very difficult to sum this up in a few moments, but let me just say that Ibn Sina took all that al-Kindi and al-Farabi had done and made a very profound transformation that many consider to be one of the greatest moments in the history of philosophy, both Western and Islamic. And that is, he made the fundamental distinctions that have characterized Islamic philosophy for the past 1,000 years between being and essence or quiddity on the one hand, and being as necessity and being as possibility or contingency on the other. I know that's a mouthful that needs unpacking, but we don't have time to go into it here, so please see the readings for more detail, and we can answer any questions on the discussion board. That concludes our overview on Ibn Sina, and now we turn to the figure of Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes in Latin, the Islamic peripatetic philosopher who had the most influence in the Western world. There was a time in Europe when Averroes was as famous as St. Thomas Aquinas. First of all, let me tell you something about him, and then we'll say something about the European Averroes, that is, the Latin Averroes. Averroes was a physician, but also a jurisprudent who became a very famous religious scholar, and finally the chief judge of Cordoba. So he was an eminent Islamic authority. In the Christian context, he would be like a bishop of some city. Being the Qadi of an Islamic city in Spain was the highest level you could reach as a religious authority. But he was also one of the most important and powerful philosophers in history. Philosophically, Ibn Rushd believed that Ibn Sina had incorporated too many Neoplatonic elements into his understanding of Aristotle, and Ibn Rushd tried to go back to the pure Aristotelian teachings. And to that end, he wrote commentaries upon all the works of Aristotle, usually short, middle, and long, 3 types of commentaries. And these were so important that he became known as the commentator. For example, when St. Thomas Aquinas wanted to read Aristotle, he said, "I don't want to read the text of Aristotle. I want to read what Averroes wrote about Aristotle." Everybody for 2 centuries in Europe, from about 1200 to around 1350, 1400, when they said Aristotle, they didn't mean Aristotle. They meant the commentator Averroes. Now, Averroes is wrongly considered to be the author of the famous double truth theory that you might have heard about, which nearly shook European civilization to its foundations. What do we mean by the double truth theory? The Europeans thought that Averroes believed that there were 2 truths, one for the philosopher, one for the masses, and it doesn't matter if these truths don't accord with one another. This is not the case. What Averroes was saying was that revelation must be followed to the last point by people who have no philosophical understanding. But ultimately, intellectual knowledge cannot negate revealed knowledge. And to that end, he wrote a book called Fasl al-Maqal, which has been translated into English by Hurani, called On the Harmony of Religion and Philosophy. And it's one of the greatest works of Islamic philosophy, in which Ibn Rushd tried to show the harmony between religion and reason. But in comparison with Al-Farabi, with Ibn Sina, not to talk about later Islamic philosophers, Averroes is the most rationalistic of all Islamic philosophers. There's no doubt about it. And it's for this very reason that he belongs a lot more to the history of Western thought than to the history of Islamic thought. Muslims who followed Islamic philosophy later on didn't take Averroes that seriously, whereas he became the most important influence upon Western philosophy from the Islamic world. And that's why there's a school which is called Latin Averroism, whereas although Ibn Sina was also very influential, there's no distinct school which is called Latin Avicennism. It is the thought of Ibn Rushd that challenged essentially early Christian theology and forced St. Thomas Aquinas and others to confront Aristotle. But there are two different Averroeses, you might say, one based on the Western view of his holding the double truth theory, and one based on his actual view on the relationship between philosophy and revelation. Anyway, Averroes in a sense marks the end of a major episode in Islamic philosophy because of the attack from the theologians on Masha'i philosophy that we'll discuss next segment. This concludes this segment on the philosophy of Ibn Sina and the most influential Islamic peripatetic philosopher on the West, Ibn Rushd.